Hello.
Hey.
Here we go again. This is another, and it will be, was it 15th? 15th episode of Biweeklycast, and hosts are still here. This is me, Dima Malenko.
And I'm Slava Rudnitsky. Today we are going to talk about something related to Teams, jargon, and communication, which is quite an intriguing topic. And since there is no follow-up this time, you could explain us why.
Right, and I think I should have updated title or proposed title because it was based on the idea I got, but I should have made it more clear. But the long story short, like typically at this point we have this question in our notes: why this topic, or supposedly why it is important. Like I don't know, like effective communication in Teams is kind of important thing, and I've got some observations and some questions I'd love to discuss with you about this. And what brought me to this is that I discovered recently that I may have a little bit of a, bias in how I approach and how I think about effective communication in the team. And I wanted to dive deeper into that with you. And I think I have a particularly like soft spot for naming things just right. You know that joke that in computer science there are two very hard problems. One is cache invalidation, and another one is naming things. So I maybe made it my life's mission to solve at least one thing. I'm not a huge expert on caches, so I'm trying to solve at least the naming part of it. So I always kind of try or starve for very, as much as it can be, like precise naming of things and concepts and abstractions that we introduce, especially given my line of my line of work. And then once we introduce them and name them, I then insist on using those names, which often leads to kind of jargonization and like coming up with acronyms. And I've got feedback from people saying that, hey, maybe you should chill down, because at one point I was arguing that no, we should use a particular acronym for a thing because it's like 18 letters shorter than just spelling out this entire thing. And at that point I started thinking maybe I should double check my assumptions and approaches for this space. So this is
so we're going to talk about not specifically naming, but getting things identified in the most effective way.
Right. Getting things identified in the most effective way, and in general how that contributes or maybe not contribute to effective communication within the team, and what would be additional means or tools that we would have to make team communication more effective, if we can try to do that.
All right. I think we are like in one definition in the notes that we should actually start with. What do you mean by effective communication? Just to be straight.
That's a very, very good question. And I would define effective communication as communication that has two important characteristics. It is precise, such that it minimizes the chance of miscommunication or misunderstanding between the parties involved in communication, and effective in a sense that it takes the least possible amount of time to reach that clarity and shared understanding of the idea between the parties involved in communication. So if we are buddies and we can talk for half an hour and work out what it is, so we get one part of this characteristic. We are precise. We deliver the message. We are on the same page, but it was not as effective because it took us half an hour. If we could do that in 2 minutes, that would be effective communication, or at least like the North Star of effective communication, the way I see it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you think that we should define jargon as well, yeah?
I wanted to put this here because, in a sense, I guess those concepts and abstractions that are introduced within a team, they would often match the definition of jargon, which I got from, I guess, first page of Google or something like this. And I quite liked this one, where they say that jargon is special words or expressions used by a profession or group that are difficult for others to understand. So if I say something like build, right, in an engineering team, we would understand that build means the result of compiling our application or whatever it is to an executable form so that it can be tested or whatever. But for people outside the group, it might not be well understood.
So back in my student years, I was engaged in a course named Effective Communication, and then defined effective communication as communication that happens with the least number of barriers possible. And both jargon and acronyms, abbreviations, were examples of such barriers that you can build. There were a few more, but basically these two were in the top of the list.
And let's dive into that, because I feel a bit contrary. I get that in general, like for the wider group of people or for communicating across groups, jargon and acronyms can really get in the way. But within the team, is it really beneficial to kind of fully spell out or fully articulate things when I can expect that in a given context, everyone would, with asterisks, right? Everyone would understand what we are talking about.
I think one of the things about effective communication that I liked back in that definition, that there was a loop. It was that you have some context behind you, and you make a message based on this context and ideas and thoughts. Then somebody gets your message, hopefully it's the same symbols and words that you said, and interprets through personal prism of context and experience. But then there's also a feedback thing, like when the person gets back to you and shows what one's understand. And I think that in many cases, people kind of ignore this last part of the scheme, and they say like, all right, we share the same context. I say the words, you understand the words, we're fine. But how do you know that people understand, or at least mostly understand what you said?
Right. I don't think that there are two ways about going about this. You ask if they understood, right? Or you...
There are many ways to approach that. In one of the books that we might discuss in the future, The Culture Code, they say that, for example, in Japan, they do have a special word or term or phrase or, I don't know, symbol, sign that says to read the air. It means to catch the context or the meaning between the words, not just the words that are said meaningfully or purposefully, but also what was not said or why it was said or some other aspects. And since you mostly collaborate with Western cultures, you probably tend to be focused on the low context side of communications. And in the high context, it's a bit different.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think I kind of approach this whole situation with the premise that teams form, or groups of people who communicate regularly, they form sort of relatively closed communication bubbles, right? So that they communicate within the group a lot more than they communicate outside of the group. And to me, that kind of is a moniker for them almost inevitably developing their own language and vocabulary to communicate about things they care about. Do you think that's fair? Would you agree or disagree with this idea or this premise?
It sounds reasonable. I would say that people who spend a lot of time, they shape the team culture that can be different from corporate culture or ethnical culture or anything else. And it could include jokes, names, shortcuts, and stuff. The thing is that this culture is not always the most effective way of communicating. And it could be based on different premises, and it could be suitable for leaders of this team, but not for all people, or it could be suitable for the majority, but ignoring the interests of minorities. So it's not always that easy. Like, let's say, I would say that team communication requires some practice, and just communicating is not the practice. It's like driving. Like you can drive many days, but you're not becoming the master or professional driver. You're just a driver. And the same thing in communication. You could have hundreds of meetings, but still statistically, we know that on average, people estimate 70 to 80% of the meetings they attend as meaningless or ineffective. And that's also part of the culture, and it happens. It is done because it's kind of comfortable for most people, and it kind of conflicts your definition of effective communication that you suggested.
Well, I think I would say that with this definition, I'm trying maybe to focus on a more specific or pointed area of communication, like expressing a way of expressing useful concepts or useful abstractions. And I get it that I may be biased, but because my work in engineering and my roles within engineering specifically often like every day require me to not necessarily to come up with new concepts, but with refining the definitions of existing concepts, like what it means that we have X, or what it means, how does it relate to Y, and so on and so forth. And that's why I'm thinking that maybe I'm overly indexing on this idea that, hey, when we invent something new that is useful for our domain, we should give it a proper name so that it can be distinguished from the other things. And I first of all wonder, how common is that in other spaces and other domains? For example, in your work, do you often come up with things that should be named, like, I don't know, like class materials or something like that? I don't know what that might be for the work you do.
Let's say that we do experiment a lot with educational formats, and sometimes they differ from the standard or classical ones, like a workshop, quite a generic term. And if we are designing something different or something that is a blend of formats, there is a bit of a workshop, a bit of a lecture, a bit of a Q&A, a bit of something, and you sometimes do need the titles. But I think that we don't create so many entities, because in the engineering world you work with more concepts, I would say, that are created and designed by you. But we should also add here that you are right now an example of basically a mono team, like a team of engineers, and it's not really representing marketologists, sales. And I can imagine that some teams, they would have a product owner, they would have a QA, a designer, and these people are very different in terms of their mindset as well. And it's not just a team of engineers. And surprisingly, when people are very different, they do have to agree on some common words and terms more even than engineers, because engineers assume that, like, when you say framework, most people understand what you're saying.
Yeah, totally. That's so true, especially in the diverse settings. When you communicate with your tightly knit group, but then have to go out, you will be surprised by the fact that the word, like the relatively common words that are being used all over the place, they are such loaded terms that when you say X, you mean this, and you assume that it kind of makes sense for X to mean this, and you go to talk to other people, and for them X means, well, maybe not entirely different thing, but distinctly different, something that would require qualification. That is my X, and this is that other X. And yeah, if you do not catch this early on, that can lead to some very peculiar incidents of misunderstanding.
And it's also interesting how this thing evolves, because on one hand, such multicultural experience requires to be very explicit. Like, we can take the United States as an example. When many cultures merged together, they were living in the same neighborhoods and they had to communicate effectively. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Yeah, and they would have to convey messages from one to another, despite being from very different backgrounds and contexts back in like a few hundred years ago. And then eventually, it kind of grew into a number of cliches and stuff that stopped being explicit and doesn't really convey meaning in them. And how a multicultural became quite low context. They still remain low context and to the point and try to be explicit, but so much formality, so many like compliments and indirect feedback, especially corrective. When people try to explain that something is not right, there would be like an entire story with a lot of compliments and ways around just to be tolerant and not to offend anyone. So I'd say that it does really depend on the team and who the people are. But I really enjoyed the article that you attached in the materials because I think people who wrote it made things worse by their examples.
Right. And let's dive into that. And maybe I can speak a little bit about how I came to that article. Maybe from the discussion we had thus far, you may see that I'm not as against like jargon and like, well, healthy dose. Let's put it this way: I'm not against healthy doses of jargon and like acronyms. And I wanted to. I went on the internet to see if there are other people who are like-minded, and I was quite surprised by abundance of articles to the extent that why trying to explain why jargon is bad and hindrance to communication and so on and so forth. And one article particularly stood out where they say article by Atlassian where they say provide 6 examples of corporate jargon you should stop using like right now, almost in all caps as they are suggesting. And I was baffled a little bit of by their examples, and maybe we can go through them and kind of evaluate how bad they are from our point of view.
Sure. Let me open the article, and
let's do that. I copied.
The first one is mission critical. Yeah.
Right.
Have you ever faced people saying mission critical?
I think so.
Because that was the first time I thought like, is that a problem? All right.
Well, yes, I've heard this a bunch of times, but I never thought it was a problem. I thought it was like a more of on the scale of idiom to signify that this thing is important, and without that thing, another important thing might fail. I didn't get the implication, as they suggest, that, hey, when I hear mission critical, I imagine rockets. Like, yes, but then I imagine...
Let's say, I think this is not the best example because critical is a synonym for essential, necessary, and needed. And in this case, there's not much misunderstanding or misleading phrases. So let's try the other one.
Right. Okay.
Another one.
So this was a bad example on their part, right? We take it like we debunked the thing. The next example they give is seamless.
And I think that the one thing I can agree here is the quote in the article, this word is overused.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that, yes, it is overused and people use seamless in many different contexts. But about being imprecise, the idea that they suggest to try instead saying smooth, continuous, uninterpreted, or fast doesn't get more precise.
Right. And I think to me, at least, this seamless is in like tech context, it would have a bit of a like special flavor. When you say seamless, you would imagine things that like typically seamless would be used in the context, well, at least I'm used to it being used in the context of integration, like seamless integration or seamless transition, right? Which to me would imply certain characteristics of the process. And I would expect if, let's say, I need to do something manually in a very specific point in time, that would be the opposite of seamless. So if someone says, like, we aim to get this process to be seamless, I would take it to mean that, we want to get rid of those things that can make it more cumbersome or error prone or something like that. So I was not baffled by this word at all. I don't know.
I think I see it from a bit different experience, because mostly where I hear it is something similar to UX. It's Alex learning experience. And they discuss the learning experience that doesn't get interruptions or blockers in the process, where you go from activity to activity, knowing what to do, how to do, and you can instinctively understand where you are and what you're doing at each stage of the course.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it would be difficult to express something like this with smooth, continuous, uninterrupted, or fast. It probably would have to be all of those things, and you would have to go into greater detail of explaining what exactly you mean by this thing.
So I can imagine that some people could use seamless just to say good. We need some good design or a good solution or good something. But yeah, I think pretty much any word like impeccable, perfect would be tricky to understand if you don't know what people mean.
Cool. Glad
the next one was really triggering for me.
All right, so explain how that one, and the next one is like full disclosure or like full transparency. How come that triggers you?
Firstly, there is a generalization there saying full. All right, let's say people strive for the perfection. Let it be full. But then the idea that they try to convey in this part is that you could basically substitute it saying phrases like, in truth, let me be direct, I'm going to be straightforward. Seriously? Most of these phrases are not really recommended to be used at all, even the ones that they suggest as substitutions, because they kind of imply that previously you were not really straightforward or truthful or honest or something. And what's the purpose of this phrase at the first place? Like, when you say something like this, what reaction do you expect from people?
Right.
Just like, please be honest. All right. After saying this, people will definitely be honest, not just because you just said it.
Right. I'm totally with you on this. Like, my beef is not with the phrase, but with the entire concept of using this in communication. It's like we were talking, like discussing contract or something like that, and now you say like, "Hey, now let's with full transparency, like let's answer this question," and you're sitting and thinking, "Wait, what was this?" For the last hour, what was true in what we discussed the last hour? It's just somewhat a ridiculous concept, and I think in practice, when people invoke something like this, that most often and most certainly means that the next thing they are going to say is not going to be as transparent or as honest as they wanted to appear.
And after this point, I just I couldn't read it seriously anymore. So the rest was like, I had a green smile on my face all the time, and like, oh, all right, let's see what you have as number 4.
All right, yeah, the number 4 is best in class or best in breed, or just best.
And I eventually agree that best is not a descriptive word unless it's statistically proven and it is the best in a specific category. But then you usually use the word fastest, cheapest, or something else, unless it's some, I don't know, catalog. But what they suggest using instead is probably not more specific. Uniquely crafted. Seriously. Specially designed. Specially for whom? Created by accounting professionals for accounting professionals.
Oh, that
Seriously.
means a lot, yeah. It's good one.
Or brought to you by the team that invented Trello. Hello, marketing of that lesson.
Yes. Oh, that's a good catch. Yep, I agree. Like, also my beef here would not be with the phrase itself, but with how and when it is used and what it implies. Because I don't remember if we discussed this on the podcast, but maybe we did. But if you go to a website of any like, how do we call water parks? They are called in English, right? The water parks. Each of them will be best in something, like best, like the highest, that they have the highest slide in the world, in the Europe, in their neighborhood, or something like that, or the longest, or the most number of them, or something else, which would set them apart and make them the best in a particular meaningless category that you don't care at all about. And yeah, that best is so relative, so it almost
Do you remember
useless.
this old joke about the word best? That there was a street with barbershops, I guess. And
No.
there was, the first one was saying on the front, the best barbershop in Europe.
Oh, nice.
Like, wow, that's impressive. And then the next one would say like, we are the best barbershop in the world. Then the next one was, we are the best barbershop in the universe. And then the last one was, we are the best barbershop on the street.
Right,
So
something along those lines.
It does depend on the point of reference. I don't think that words that they suggest as alternatives are actual alternatives. I would use something more specific. But the question is, what is meaningful for the person who is picking this? If you're picking the restaurant, you probably want to know the quality of food and the pricing and maybe the service. Like, these could be three components that kind of matter. Plus, possibly, I can imagine people would care about the interior and design.
Right.
So just talk about these four.
Right. The people would be interested in kind of absolute characteristics of a place, not its relative place in relation to God knows what. But about this specific point, let me ask you this question. I don't think I've seen this, something like this used a lot in marketing or advertisements and so on and so forth, but I don't really remember seeing this in like work related, like working communication. So I'm not sure if this was the article written by marketers and might be something that they see a lot and they are annoyed by it, but I don't think I've seen this a lot in, at least in the communication I partake in.
I would say that people in business circles would use the word top. Like, that's a top trainer, that's a top manager, top performer, top something, without specifying how exactly they measure this. And I think it's just a different word there, but it still has the same illusion around, not best, but like, he's our top engineer. Like, all right, top engineer, whatever that means.
Oh, yep, makes sense. Makes sense this way. Shall we move to the next one, which is leverage?
I kind of got lost at this one.
So on this one, I was quite disagreeing with them because I find myself using word leverage quite a lot in certain situations, and I have very specific meaning I put into this word, which I hope.
Is it related to physics?
It is inspired by physics. Let me put it this way. So the context and the meaning I use the word leverage would be when we have something that is already there, or it exists, or like it does its particular purpose, but then we take it and do something more with it, something that's maybe unexpected, or something that amplifies the value of this initial thing. And this would be the context of the situation where I would say that we would leverage X to do Y, implying that having X gives us a distinct advantage to achieve something more, like with liver in physics, when you leverage the liver to do more than you can.
It does make sense, but totally opposite from what these guys are writing.
Right. So yeah, everything is relative. It depends on context.
For the word everything, yeah. The last one was the single source of truth, and this is where I also kind of stumbled, because I've never heard people using the word single source of truth.
I think
it was like the first time I've seen it was in this article.
May there be something wrong with me, because I also use this single source of truth thing quite often, but also with a very specific meaning where, let's say, we have, I don't know, have you had anything like this where you would say you would have a spreadsheet described something, but then that spreadsheet gets outdated and someone creates somewhat updated version of the spreadsheet containing a subset of information, and then in order to understand what exactly is going on, you need to refer to both of spreadsheets and then compile the information in that to come up with an understanding. So this would be the situation where I would say, like, no, that's not right. We need single source of truth for this kind of information. Hopefully supported or implemented as a technical thing that would prevent those secondary sources of truth from appearing.
I think I kind of agree with the way it sounds with the authors of the article when they say that there is the right information when you say the truth. Because basically, the source of information or the single source of data makes a lot of sense. Right. But when you say the single source of truth, it kind of sounds more like an encyclopedia where everything is defined in truth. And what you say, it's more like source of data, or not like they suggest as a substitution, the knowledge base. It does make more sense to me now as I listen to you, but I've never faced it, so I'm probably not the best reference here.
Well, that's interesting point, which kind of brings me to another concept from the world of engineering once again, where I think specifically about the word truth, right, where they suggest to represent this with right or correct information or something like that. I think, to me, the word truth here is sort of meaningful in a sense that, imagine like when you build, let's say, a system or something like that, and you have like physical system that let's say that has a pipe, and the pump is attached to that pipe, and there is a switch that turns the pipe, the pump on and off, and then there is an indicator that shows if the pump is on or off. Like, one super naive way to implement this system would be that when you calibrate the state of the lamp and state of the switch such that, like, the switch is off, the lamp is also off, and then you connect lamp to the switch, so every time you switch the switch, the lamp turns off and on, and supposedly when you turn switch, the pump goes on and off. And if those things are in sync, then it kind of makes sense. You get what you expected. But as we know it, things can rarely be in sync, especially when multiple moving parts is involved. And it's easy to imagine the situation where you think you turned the pump on, the lamp goes on, you turn the pump on, lamp goes on, but the pump itself does not turn on because just it's a separate process, separate from the lamp going on. And in this case, this lamp, even though it's an piece of information, an indicator, but it's not the source of truth for what it's trying to convey. The source of truth would be the actual state of the pump, if it's on or off. And I guess when I'm using this single source of truth, I want that truth to be like actual representation of the reality, not some way of kind of mimicking it or getting the data or getting the information from a secondary source. And this is, like, to me, considerations like this make the word truth in single source of truth kind of meaningful. And this is how I typically use this. This thing.
In this example, it does make sense. While I was listening to you, I thought about two more, like a task manager, let's say Jira or Trello or something. And it's supposed to be the single source of truth for managers, but it's supposed to. Let's put it this way.
Right.
And back in your example that you suggested with some charts with data, I think the word truth kind of means that the information there is also high quality. And you never know whether this research is really the most representing or it was done in an effective way. You just know that this is a go-to place where people check first. But why they do so and whether there is a better place to do that, that's a question. Like previously, we would use paper dictionaries for the meaning of the words. That would be the place where we go and look for a new word if we face something. These days, we just either use the automated translation version or we check a few websites and not often check even the source of it.
And that's, I guess, a great point, because here I would take the truth to mean that means that this information is kind of reliable insofar that if you try to dig deeper, you will not find any difference. You will arrive at the same result. Whereas in some other contexts, it is possible that if you pay a little more attention or dive a bit deeper into that, you will get something, an indication or piece of information that would be completely opposite that is indicated on the surface.
So I think that this article was mostly overall fighting with some cliches and phrases that they believe could be imprecise or ineffective. And your concern here was that team can create some labels and tags that are meaningful and they are the shortcuts in the communication. Instead of saying a long way, like let's say in Slava we have neuroscience. This term in our case means the way people's attention work, the way people's focus work, and some attention grabbers and stuff. We have videos, we have descriptors, we have documentation that describing this term. But when somebody says like, well, you should improve this workshop plan in terms of neuroscience, you know where to go and check what it means. It's not just a buzzword or something generic. There is a document named neuroscience and in Slava methodology thing. So I can totally understand why you are voting for specific terms and having the entitled meanings for specific words.
And I think there is still, even though the article says there are 6 examples, and we discussed those 6 examples, I think this article is a bit of a give that keeps giving, because the very last thing they have is that PSA, like I'm quoting here, like PSA, semicolon, English idioms can be confusing for non-native speakers. And while I agree, like idioms, not only English idioms, but any idiom can be confusing to someone who is not familiar with that. But I wanted to highlight the fact that in the beginning of the statement that they place the PSA. Do you know what PSA stands for? I think like, first of all, like PSA is a TLA, right? A 3-letter acronym. And I think it stays for public service announcement or something like that. I should have looked it up. And this I thought would be a perfect transition to the next kind of subtopic in this entire thing, like the TLAs themselves. Like, what do you think about coming up with abbreviations or acronyms for things that you use quite often, and like how do you go about this whole process? And in the meantime, I'll check what PSA stands for.
I do hear some abbreviations or TLAs. They are usually related to job titles. Let's say CEO, CFO, and blah, blah, blah. Sometimes they are types of documents like NDA and this sort of things. And I think that mostly they are used in the context when people assume that everyone knows who CEO is or what NDA is, and there is no need to explain, because if we need, we can always say Chief Executive Officer. It actually doesn't explain much, but still we can. Or non-disclosure agreement, which still, if you don't read it, you don't know what it means and what it implies. But you could say it in a full way. In some cases, it's getting really trendy, and it kind of substitutes the initial word, so you don't really remember what this TLA was originally about, and you just keep using it. But I think that's not a big deal, honestly. It's a big deal for public speakers and people who are communicating across teams. Like, for example, I wouldn't appreciate if my sales team would use a lot of TLAs in the conversation. But inside the team, it seems perfectly fine.
Right. And me trying to look up the meaning of PSA, at least in this context, is a perfect example of why TLAs are not great in general. Because as I said, I thought it stands for public service announcement, and that's probably correct for this context. But if you ask Google what does PSA mean, Google very stubbornly suggests that PSA means prostate-specific antigen found in blood. So the PSA, it stands for this. So this is the shortcoming of PSAs. There are only so many of them, right? And some of them are overloaded and can have a lot of different meanings or stand for a lot of different things. And it is
what do
very
you think is
heavily
the
dependent
issue
on the
with
context.
abbreviations? By the way, do you happen to know the difference between abbreviation and the acronym?
I should happen to know,
You
but I would not be
shouldn't.
able to articulate. I don't
It's the way you
think without
pronounce the
thinking.
word. When you say an abbreviation, you just pronounce all the letters, like the EU or the CEO. And for the acronyms, like NATO, you read it like a word. You don't read every single letter.
Oh wow! So PSA is not a TLA.
It's abbreviation. It is. It's not an acronym.
It's not an acronym because TLA is three-letter acronym. Oh wow! Internet had it all wrong.
Well, I think people don't really care about this stuff because they know
TLAs.
both terms, abbreviation and acronym, and who cares? But I think we could get back to the point. Like, you think that using such three-letter constructions is ineffective?
No, I think it can be rather effective. In fact, I'll be in favor of using them in certain situations, right? If we are talking within the team, I know for sure that let's say it's team chat. We are talking about the conversation goes in the context of what we are doing, and there are certain things which can be described by easily recognizable TLAs, easily recognizable within that context. I think I personally would prefer to use a TLA rather than spelling out the entire thing. And but I would be extremely cognizant of the fact that when there is a chance that this communication might involve outsiders, we need to take extra care and clarify what we mean by a TLA, by a particular acronym.
No, I think another interesting case where it could be discussed is texts when you write an article, for example. A few weeks ago, I was reading a statistical research about religion in Ukraine. Don't ask me why, but it just happened so. And Ukrainian church organizations tend to be TLAs. Like, what they say is like Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or Church of Pam Pam Pam. And it's UPC, PCU, and then they start adding some extra letters. It's like UPC, MP, and at a certain point, it's fine. Like, when you read one word and then it's repeated a few times, you kind of get used to it. But then when they start comparing these things, and ABC is much worse than CDA because this is not an NDA, and all right, thank you. And I knew all of them because before in the article they would explain each of those, but you can probably keep in your mind just a few when they are new for you. And the speed when it gets meaningful to you is not as fast as some people could assume.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like at least to me, subjectively, one of the benefits of using TLAs for concepts is that when at least when I look at something that has like three words describing it, like for example, like DNA, right? Geez, I don't know how to pronounce that, like the full how to expand this in English, but you know what I'm telling, that like the DNA to me feels like a more kind of coherent entity rather than what would it be, like desoxyribonucleic acid or something like this. So like when it's DNA, to me it feels like tighter and a better representation of a particular concept rather than the full description of it. To like at that time, it doesn't feel like a concept to me, and therefore I'm a bit in favor of using TLAs when it's possible to give things their particular significance as distinct concepts. But at the same time, when I also like it that when TLAs are used sparingly, they stand out in a sentence, right? That would be like you say, like something DNA something. So like DNA all in all caps kind of stands out in that sentence. But then if you have too many of those things that stand out, they kind of get lost, as in the example you just gave with churches and their names. And at that point, I think for the purpose of clarity and efficiency of communication, I think I would prefer maybe to spell that out fully, to articulate that these are different things. They're not similar merely through the fact that they are TLAs which stand out comparing to the rest of the text.
Listeners of our podcast today would feel frustrated by the number of abbreviations we have used.
Oh, we can throw a bit more to make sure, like to make sure that they're going to be frustrated.
I think I would.
So that there's no doubt about that. The clarity, right? To achieve for extreme clarity and full disclosure.
I remembered. I think it was one of the offline IT events that I was speaking at back in pre-COVID times. And it was probably a speech of one of the marketing people. I'm not sure like what the title was, BizDev, CMO, or whatever. CMO is also a TLA. But they use a lot of abbreviations in metrics when they speak about NPS and like
LTV.
It's crazy. I was reading about learning analytics, and the book is like an entire abbreviation. And sometimes they're merged, sometimes they get evolved, sometimes they go squared, sometimes something else happens. I think people in analytics do love TLAs, and I understand why, because when this is your job and you do it daily, it would be a huge waste of time saying such things aloud. But the thing is that if you are mindful and you can actually, when you switch the context, switch your language, like by speaking at a generic IT event, you stop being an analyst who uses just the abbreviations, and you explain multiple times what it means, not just hoping that, all right, so guys, these are the 6 abbreviations I'm going to use. Let's roll.
Mm-hmm. Right. I totally agree with that. And also, I think maybe, again, this is something that's subjective to me and other people see it differently. When I come across the TLA, because of what I described just now, and the idea that I want TLAs to mean something new, like,
I'm sorry, what's the TLA?
To be a distinct concept. When I come across 3-letter acronym. Well, that's a good one, because that illustrates the point I was trying to drive at, is that when I meet a TLA and it looks vaguely familiar, it is a signal. I take this as a signal to double check, like, what do people mean by this TLA? Like you just checked me. Like, are we still talking about the same TLA concept that we started with, or have we switched context to a different domain and TLA now means something different? So I take this as an extra signal that, hey, maybe I'll need to double check what specifically they mean when they use this TLA, to an extent that this signal is stronger, at least for me, than when I see just a word being used, like acronym or something like this. I would just glance over the acronym and not stop at this, but on something like TLA, I would stop to. Well, I would be more likely to stop and double check the meaning there than just with regular words. And like one other peculiar thing about TLAs, I do, despite of the challenges and stuff like that, I do have a lot of respect for governmental institutions in the UK. And when I was researching the topic of TLA and trying to gauge whether people think TLAs are good or bad, I came across this style guide, of all things, style guide on gov.uk, where they apparently provide styling guidance for all the governmental institutions on how they should communicate to citizens. And they have little specific sections on TLA where they say the first time you use abbreviation or acronym, explain it at full on each page unless it is well known. And they assume that something like DVLA is a well known, and granted, I guess in UK DVLA is a well known thing, that this is, I think it's Driver and Vehicle Licensing Authority. But also they have a very good recommendation. Like, apart from this, I think this is a good recommendation. This is what I try to do myself. Like, in the document, the first time I want to coin a TLA or term, I would explain what I mean by that, and then kind of assume that later on I can just use the abbreviated form. They say that if you think an acronym is well known, please provide evidence that 80% of the UK population will understand and commonly use it. Evidence can be from search analytics or testing of a representative sample.
I suggest that we can humiliate you a bit. Would you mind?
Yeah, well, sure. Is this not entire podcast a way to humiliate me?
No. Just this section specifically, because you mentioned a style guide, and just a few weeks ago, I bought a style guide by The Economist. And
man, you are so next level.
That's quite a book, I should say. And at first, I thought that I would read it, but it's not for reading. It's like what was the
probably it's not readable.
Something source of truth, single source
of
truth.
Single source of truth. Yep.
It's a place to go when you would like to know something or to check something. And
a destination.
One of the sections here is technology abbreviations.
All right.
Well, you work in tech, so probably you know most of them, right?
Yeah, I should. You would expect me. I hope I don't have to go for an interview anytime soon.
Let's start with some easy ones. AOL.
Sure. Wait.
AOL.
America Online.
Yep. CPC.
CPC. Specimen packaging container.
Cost per click.
Oh, CPC.
It was a CPC.
Yeah,
I should be more explicit here. I'm sorry.
No. I'm making things up.
The next one should be easy. FAQ.
Frequently asked questions.
Mm-hmm. And not as easy. FSF.
Free Software Foundation.
That was surprising. FTP.
File Transfer Protocol.
Mm-hmm. GSM.
It's a global switch something.
System for mobile communication. Yep.
Wait, there are 3 letters. You said 5 words.
It does. IMAP.
IMAP. IMAP. The last one is definitely protocol, but I don't remember. I know that it's used for email and catalog access. But I don't
it is
remember
Internet
what's
Message Access Protocol.
that. Mhm.
IRL.
IRL
IRL.
in real life.
Yeah, you're actually very good. I wouldn't guess even half here.
I'm surprised.
LTE.
LTE. No, no. I don't know what
It's
it
a
stands
long-term evolution.
for. Right. Yeah, that's 5G or 4G networking standards.
Mhm.
Standard. Yeah.
And then something casual, LAN, LAN.
LAN, local area network.
Mhm. NAP,
NAP,
Network
some sort of
Access
protocol.
Point.
All right. Okay.
Oh, and there are actually a few more pages, but I think we should stop here.
All right. Yeah, it's good stuff. Good stuff.
And this guide is kind of a reminder that our next episode is going to be a book club, not with this specific style guide, but still.
Mm-hmm. And we need to still need to choose and read the book. Is it going to be the culture code you just mentioned?
I suggested two. It could be the decision book or about the decision-making models and mental models, or the culture code. And the choice is yours because I'm going to read both anyway.
I'll probably have to do the same, but maybe let's stick with the culture code.
All right, so the culture code it is next time in the book club.
Right. Awesome. Have a good week
Yep.
or weeks.
Good week.